So you are famously Britain's strictest headmistress, right?
Yes.
Talk about how you achieve that title. What is it about Michaela which is distinctive in this respect?
Yeah, so I think people think that I march up and down the corridors with whips and chains, but that's ridiculous. But I believe very much in consistency, and I am sort of old-fashioned and traditional. That I believe that children should be obedient. You know, like that word, for instance, has gone out of fashion completely. I always say, you know, in the day, throughout my teaching career, and I've been doing this for over 25 years, you know, it used to be the case that we talk about praise and punishment, but then that changed. I said, oh, no, you can't talk about punishment. That's too harsh on them. Let's make it sanctions. So then we talked about sanctions. And then they said, oh, no, sanctions, it's too difficult for them to hear that word. Let's talk instead about corrections. So then we all talked about corrections. This is over years. Then eventually they said, oh, no, that doesn't work. Let's now talk about consequences. Eventually you get to the point now, I'd say, where there are some people who don't believe there should be consequences at all for poor behavior. And that somehow you hate children if you do want to give them a consequence. So I don't just believe in consequences. I believe in praise and punishment. And I believe that children need both in order to thrive. I think it's a silly idea that children are sort of mature enough to have a deep philosophical conversation around why you might do X, Y, and Z. I mean, you can explain these things to them, of course you can, but to expect them to understand this on a deep level and therefore change their behavior without a praise and punishment system is just silly. So, and what does that mean? You get detentions. Whoop-de-doo. I mean, so what? You do a 30-minute detention, you go home at the end. So we are very consistent on that. All of the teachers follow the rules here. All of us love the kids. You know, that's the other thing is they think, well, there is punishment, but there's also praise. And as long as you punish kids in an atmosphere of love where they know that you're on their side and they know why you are punishing them, they will accept it. And not only will they accept it, they'll actually thank you for it. But that is very much because of our values that we pump with the kids. You know, we very much believe in a set of values like taking personal responsibility, having a duty towards others, self-sacrifice for the sake of the whole, being, that's to do with the personal responsibility, but being responsible, turning up on time, being kind to others, working hard, being grateful. These are all values that we teach actively in the school constantly. And again, people will object to this. I mean, I don't really understand why anybody would object to it. If you come and visit our school, and you're very welcome, and all your listeners are welcome, you just go on the website, you sign up, you can come and have a tour with the kids, you can have lunch with the kids, and you'll just see a bunch of really happy kids. And you'll see what's possible. That's what I always say, is when you come here, you think, wow, you mean every school could be like this? Yeah, every school could be like this if everyone were to just understand what children need. And I don't think they do.
Mm-hmm. So some of the things you do, this is what I've not had the pleasure of visiting yet, right? I would like to. What I've read about and heard about is some of the things you do are quite sort of classic old-fashioned school rules. So things like no talking in the corridors. So kids have to walk between classes in silence. Mm-hmm. Standing up when teachers come in the room. Am I right about that? Things like that. I did that at school. That's not too crazy.
Yeah. Well, actually, they only stand for me at assembly.
Okay.
So when we first opened, we had conversations around, well, would this work? Would that work? What is it like practically? And we thought about them standing up when teachers come into the rooms, but because we're so good at sharing good practice, I have teachers coming in and out of classrooms all the time, sitting at the back, taking notes, saying, oh, I'm going to take that idea, I'm going to do this, that's really good. And they're learning from each other. So if the children stood up every time a teacher came into the room, they would be standing up all the time. And I didn't want that, so we didn't do that. But at assembly, which they have with me once a week, they stand at that moment. You know, the head of year says, stand for the headmistress, and then I walk in. These are rituals, and rituals are so important, not just for children, but for adults. The ritual of sitting down and having dinner with your family every night the ritual of taking a bath every evening and brushing your teeth, the ritual of sitting down at your desk in the same place to do your homework, the ritual of walking that same walk to school every day. So standing for your headmistress, sitting down at the lunch dining hall in the same way. Their ritual is what gives us a kind of structure. Now, what the critics will say is they'll say, oh, but the problem is we want children to be creative, we want them to think for themselves. And in such a structured, old-fashioned environment, people are not able to be creative. I always think it's quite funny when they say that, when I think of, all the great philosophers and historians and scientists and mathematicians that have existed for hundreds of years. They were very creative and they all thought for themselves. They came out of a very traditional education. And so it is the modern education system that does not allow people to be creative and think for themselves. The irony is, and I can see why we think that this is wrong, because it doesn't seem intuitive, but the fact is the structure and the order is what allows children to feel safe enough to push the boat out. So they don't put their hands up thinking, oh gosh, the bullies in the class are going to laugh at me. Oh gosh, I'm going to seem like teacher's pet. If it's the case that the culture is one of love, where people will get punished because it's consistently done in every lesson, then that means that the teacher is in charge. And that comes, and not the bullies, right? So it's not that the child in the class does not think I'm worried about the bullies, because the child is being led by the teacher who is in a position of authority. And that's another value of ours, which I think has been lost nowadays. This idea of authority, that we adults should be in charge and that the children should be told to do what we want them to do. Now, that doesn't mean within that, you don't allow them some space to be able to express themselves or to be able to create their own piece of homework or whatever it is. That's fine. But we do very much need to be in a position of authority leading the way. And nowadays, parents want to be friends with their children. Teachers want to be friends. It's very much we're on a par. And I think that thinking comes from the talk around equality and fairness, which often comes, it has to be said, from the left, and that those are the lenses through which they see. Jonathan Haidt is very good on this in his book Righteous Mind, where he says those are the two big things for the left: fairness and equality. And for those who lean more to the right, there are things like the idea of what is sacred, and that, the old-fashioned things, because I do think that there are some sacred cows on the left as well, but the more conservative-minded person feels that children being children, adults being in a position of authority, that is very sacred to a small c conservative. And so the way in which they will speak to children, their expectations of children are very different. And so when people come here and they say, oh gosh, how do you do it? I do have to point to our small c conservative values, which I'm afraid a lot of people just want to reject because they are small c conservative and they're old and fuddy-duddy and so on. But I do think they work, and they have worked for hundreds of years.